Hello, I'm Jocelyn Paul. Wendy Steep and I welcome you to Professor Sue-Ann Kelman's lecture on Olga Tokarczuk's novel, Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. Sue-Ann Kelman is a professor emeritus at Ryerson University, where she taught radio broadcasting, eventually becoming the director of broadcast. She was an excellent choice to teach radio journalism. Sue-Ann began her career as a producer and writer for CBC's Sunday Morning. It was Suzanne who week after week came up with the clues for that fiendish headliner quiz. She moved on to the Journal, where she eventually was in charge of current affairs. A prolific idea person, she became a producer for CBC's Ideas. In 1993, she became an associate professor of journalism at Ryerson. Currently, Sue-Ann creates documentaries for TVO's The Agenda and has appeared regularly as a panelist. She has written for The Report on Business, The Globe and Mail, Chatelaine, Toronto Life, and the Literary Review of Canada. She wrote a definitive book on family life entitled All in the Family, A Cultural History of the Family, in which she expressed her belief in the permanence of the family structure. She has been a judge for the National Newspaper Award and the Radio and TV News Directors Award. She was a consultant for CBC's The Current in its infancy. In 1998, Sue-Ann joined the Literary Lecture Series as a lecturer. The first novel she tackled was Captain Corelli's Mandolin. She now delivers 30 lectures a year to Toronto book clubs. Although she comments critically on works of fiction, biography, and history, her present focus is on fake news and its dire consequences for democracy. A graduate in English language and literature from U of T, Sue-Ann's first university job was teaching literature at Fora Bay College in Sierra Leone. To quote Sue-Ann, "It was there that I came to understand the skills that served me so well at Ryerson: favor swapping, political alliances, and blackmail." One of her memorable experiences was interviewing Kazuo Ishiguro 3 weeks before he won the Booker Prize for The Remains of the Day. One of her regrets is writing a gossip column titled The Tattler for the Globe and Mail. She lasted for 6 months before resigning in a fit of disgust. The Literary Lecture Series has never regretted asking Sue-Ann to speak about notable books. Enjoy her lecture on Olga Tokarczuk's novel, Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. Thank you.
I apologize for my hair, which has reached the pandemic point of no return. I want to start by acknowledging that I recognize this is a very strange novel. Although in some ways it is structured like a murder mystery, I think that the easiest way to approach it is as a fairy tale, but one that's told by the witch. Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead really is shaped like a mystery, with as many grisly deaths as an Agatha Christie novel, but with distinctly surreal elements that I'll discuss later. It's narrated by a woman who seems to believe that the animals from the surrounding forest have turned on their hunters and are killing them. So be honest as you ask yourself a nice, obvious plot question. Were you surprised by the identity of the murderer? And if not, when did you realize that Janina was the killer? For me, the answer became obvious when Janina dressed for the mushroom gatherers' party as a wolf. If you know your fairy tales, that's a pretty glaring clue. If you missed that one and you're familiar with murder mysteries, you might have picked up on a later package, right after Janina has been fired as a teacher. She writes, "I had everything I needed in the samurai." And note that it's no accident that she drives a samurai, of all things. "Falling before my eyes, the twilight was in my favor. It always favors people like me." So what could she possibly have needed, and for what purpose? I was reminded of, and only the reviewer for the LA Times had the same response, of a classic Agatha Christie Christie mystery, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. As Hercule Poirot discovers in that one, from a confession that the murderer sends him, the murderer is the narrator, Dr. Shepard, the man who found the body and called the police. The only clue pointing to him is that he writes he did what had to be done before the police arrived. Now, the reviewers hated the novel because of that and attacked Christie for cheating. She defended her plot by arguing that there was nothing he could have had to do except to destroy evidence and fabricate fake clues, which is exactly what he did. Tokarczuk doesn't even bother with that much of an explanation. She told one interviewer, and this is a quote, "Just writing a book to know who is the killer is wasting paper and time. So if you found the plot unsatisfying, she doesn't care." Don't beat yourself up if you didn't figure it out. Janina herself suffers from selective amnesia about the murders, right up until the point where she sets fire to the church and incinerates the priest. She belongs to the tradition of the unreliable narrator. If you're not familiar with the concept, and I'm quite sure some of you are, the unreliable narrator writes in the first person, as I, but he or she cannot be trusted to tell the story truthfully or accurately. He or she forces you, the reader, to evaluate the information you're receiving, to fill in the blanks, to assemble the real meaning from the false message that you're being given. Now, where might you have encountered this kind of fiction before? The most likely place is in high school. If your group read Wuthering Heights, you might remember that Ellen Ornell tells much of the story, but through the ends of her own envy, family loyalty, and her implacable hatred of Heathcliff. My own all-time favorite unreliable narrator is Arun in Molly Keane's Good Behavior, which was published in 1981 but set and probably largely written in the 1930s. Here's the thing about Good Behavior. You read the first chapter and you are horrified by the narrator Arun's vicious treatment of her mother, by her hypocrisy and her self-deceit and her infinite self-regard. But when you finish the book, you race back to that first chapter to savor Arun's thinly disguised abuse of her mother, because by this time you want to see her mother suffering. Janina is far more intelligent than Arun, but I think the novel turns conventional morality on its head in the same way. So Olga Tokarczuk has devoted enormous effort and great erudition on literature, entomology, trees, and above all astrology, which I'll return to create the story of a woman whose vision of the world is completely at odds with most of the surrounding culture. Those constant digressions into learned dissertations are, by the way, absolutely typical of Tokarczuk's style. James Wood, who was reviewing Flights in the New Yorker in 2018, noted that, quote, "It is intermittently a work of fiction, but it is also an exercise in theory, cultural anthropology, and memoir. There are many essays on airports, hotel lobbies, the psychology of travel, guidebooks, the atavistic pleasures of a single Polish word, the aphorisms of E.M. Chorin. Flights devotes some time to praising Herman Melville's Moby Dick, a novel which has obviously influenced her style. Now, Janina knows that her neighbors see her as an old woman, gone off her rocker living in this wilderness, useless and unimportant. And there is considerable evidence that she is mad, at least part of the time. For instance, she kills people, and then she forgets she's done it. I don't think you have to be a psychiatrist to see that as seriously abnormal. Then astrology, her belief that the planets determine everything in life, so it's completely predetermined, which is an idea, of course, that relieves her of responsibility for the murders. But we have to be careful about our conclusions here. Everyone has their own quirks. I suspect that Olga Tokarczuk takes astrology a lot more seriously than, for instance, I do. Then we have Janina's belief that the animals, specifically the deer, are directing her. In the real world, that would definitely suggest schizophrenia. And finally, though it's a smaller point, her apparent belief as she kills him that the president wants her to do it, which is a not uncommon delusion of sadists. It seems to me that we want, if not need, to know how the author sees Janina. And to determine that, here are some of the things we know about Tokarczuk. She trained as a psychologist at the University of Warsaw. which means, given her age, that she finished her education under communism. Before becoming a full-time writer, she practiced as a therapist in Wrocław. She sees herself as a Jungian, which I think is no surprise as you read the book. She's clearly obsessed with symbols, archetypes, and collective identity, although she did say that it was reading Freud that turned her into a writer, something I'd like to know more about. Aside from her writing, she runs a private publishing company, Ruta. She has a son, Zbigniew, now 35 years old, by her first husband. She is married to Grigor Zygadło, a translator of Polish into Spanish and vice versa. She now lives, like the narrator of this novel, quite near the Czech border, in the village of Krajinov near Nova Ruda. She's a very successful author. She won the 2018 Booker International Prize for her novel Flights. That book and some of the other 9 she's written have won many other important awards. Above all, she received the 2018 Nobel Prize for Literature. Now, she's not the first Pole to receive that award. There was Henryk Sienkiewicz, the author of Quo Vadis in 1905, Władysław Reymont in 1924, and Czesław Miłosz in 1980. Some Polish websites also claim, rather shakily, Isaac Bashevis' Singer in 1978, though in fact he fled the country 40 years before and wrote not in Polish but in Yiddish. Still, most countries would cherish Tokarczuk for her accomplishments, not Poland. It's true that she has sold more than 1 million copies in her homeland, which one publishing magazine called an unprecedented phenomenon. But she's less popular there than the Silesian novelist Stepan Twardoch. Moreover, she's a constant target of hate mail and social media attacks. Now, why? Poland, as most of you know, has swung towards the conservative, religious, nationalist right in the past few years. Tokarczuk, leftist, atheist, feminist, globalist, is the embodiment of the opposite values. She's written in the past about Jewish themes, which is always a tricky thing to do for Poland. Her epic novel, The Books of Jacob, published in Polish in 2014, deals with the false messiah Jacob Frank, who lived in Poland in the 18th century. The novel, of course, explores Polish anti-Semitism, and it aroused a lot of emotion. I would love to read it, but it is not yet available in English translation, and I don't speak Polish. However, a year after the novel came out, Tokarczuk was denounced by the Nova Ruda Patriots Association, which demanded that the council revoke her honorary citizenship of the town. Why? Because it claimed she had tarnished the good name of the Polish nation. This novel, Drive Your Plow, was adapted as a film, Spoor, in 2017, co-directed by Agnieszka Holland, who has an international reputation, and her daughter, Kasia Adamik. One Polish reviewer condemned the film, and by extension the novel, as, quote, a deeply anti-Christian film that promotes eco-terrorism. Here is the trailer, unfortunately in Polish, but I think you will get the drift.
Bóg dał miejsce zwierzętom niżej. Taki jest porządek świata.
To co mam zrobić? Przyszłam zgłosić morderstwo. Zamordowano młodego dzika.
Ale pani ma jazdę.
I nawet nikt tego nie zauważy. Holokaust. Co to jest? Wygląda dziwnie, zobacz. To komendant. Czekaj.
Na miejscu zdarzenia widziała pani coś podejrzanego?
Racic, sarnik zapewne.
Pani Duszejko.
Dlaczego pan się wzdryga przed taką myślą? Co w niej jest nie tak? Oni polowali! Historia zna wiele sprawców zwierzęcych zbrodni.
Zacznie się nowy cykl.
i rzeczywistość urodzi się na nowo.
Remember, Poland has not experienced the growing rejection of the Catholic Church that we're seeing now even in Ireland or in our own Newfoundland because of the revelations of child sexual abuse and then the cover-up of that from the authorities. That might be because the Church, under constant threat from the communist authorities until the fall of the Soviet Union, didn't have the same amount of power to abuse. It could be seen as a victim. Moreover, and more important, for Poles, the Church, along with the Solidarity movement, became the embodiment of resistance to the Soviet regime, personified in particular by John Paul II, the Polish Pope, who is a figure almost of worship in Poland. In fact, you can probably scratch that almost. Conveniently shelving the contribution of Jews to Polish culture, and before the Second World War, they constituted a third of the population there. Poles now, like the schoolhead in this novel, have made Catholicism a necessary condition of Polish identity. Even Protestants no longer qualify. Polish nationalism has never been more intense. Meanwhile, Tokarczuk wrote last year in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung of her fears that COVID would further aggravate Poland's increasing rejection of refugees and immigrants. She added that, quote, the old egoisms and categories of ours and theirs, which we fought against in the hope that they would never again affect our way of thinking, have returned. The country has just cut back enormously on reproductive rights, and the attitude to the animal rights movement is pretty close to the sermon that Father Russell delivers in this book. I think it's difficult in my urban world, if not yours, to understand just how seriously some Europeans take hunting. Hunters' associations in France and Germany, as well as Poland, really do spend time discussing the ethical slaughter of animals in honor of their patron saint, Saint Hubert. Hunting is a cult in Poland, where bigos, pretty well the national dish, has to include game. I know that pierogi dumplings may be more common, but they have equivalents in the rest of Eastern Europe. Bigos is Polish. No surprise, Olga Tokarczuk is deeply involved in the animal rights movement. Finally, she shares some of Janina's need for isolation from other people. She wrote last year in The New Yorker, and this is a long quotation, sorry. For the longest time, I have felt there's been too much world. Too much, too fast, too loud. So I'm not experiencing any isolation trauma, and it isn't hard on me, not at all, not to see people. I'm not sorry that the cinemas have closed. I am completely indifferent to the fact that shopping centers have shuttered. I do worry, of course, when I think of all the people who have lost their jobs. But when I learned of the impending quarantine, I felt something like relief. I know many people felt similarly, even if they also felt ashamed of it. My introversion, long strangled and abused by hyperactive extroverts, has brushed itself off and come out of the closet, which is an interesting perspective. So given all that, how do we think Olga Tokarczuk sees Janina? Let's consider what we actually know for sure about Janina. For the record, much as she hates them, her names mean something. Janina has Hebrew roots and means God is gracious, and Duseshko means little soul. Janina was a bridge engineer, forced to retire by ill health, what she calls her ailments with a capital A. I don't think it's possible to determine the nature of her illnesses aside from an excessive sensitivity to sunlight. Because of that, I did consider porphyria, which would also count for some of her pains and mental health issues. But if she had that, Dr. Ali would have diagnosed it. She's moved to a village near the Czech border from Broklau, which was Breslau or Breslov in earlier centuries, by the way. She's teaching young children English through most of the book and acting as a caretaker for some of the summer people with houses in the area. She has not married or had children. It takes us a while, but we eventually learn that her two girls, with a capital G, were dogs, not daughters. She has a sex life, but it seems of little significance to her. In the course of the novel, she tells us she has had affairs with a Protestant who designed motorways and suffered, and then with a Catholic, of whom she writes, "For some time I shared my bed with a Catholic, and nothing good came of it." And that's it. She does end up in bed with Boris, the entomologist. All she writes is, "I raised the quilt and invited him to join me, but as I am neither maudlin nor sentimental, I shall not dwell on it further." So much for the reader. Animals raise far stronger emotions in Janina than men. We have to wait until quite late in the book to find out that her 2 little girls were dogs, not children. Their deaths, in fact murders, cause her unbearable anguish. But she anthropomorphizes other animals as well. The deer, for instance, are her ladies. Aside from teaching and custodial duties, she has 2 avocations: her astrology and helping her friend Dizzy translate the poems of William Blake. Let's start with the easy one, which is the roles that Blake's writing and ideas play in the novel. Her ideas on animals, his ideas on animals fit perfectly with Janina's. Lines from his poem Proverbs from Hell are the beginning of each chapter. Almost all of them express the same sentiment as the only one that I still remembered from high school: "A robin redbreast in a cage puts all of heaven in a rage." The poem even provides the novel's cumbersome title: "In seed time learn, in harvest teach, in winter enjoy. Drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead." Fairly ruthless advice, but I'm old enough to appreciate it. Janina would, of course, cherish Blake's instruction that all wholesome food is caught without a net or a trap. Blake is entwined with the central themes of the book, our treatment of animals and what it reveals about our society. So your reaction to the novel will inevitably reflect your own attitudes to that theme. Or to put it more brutally, I suspect that vegetarians have an easier time with Drive Your Plow than carnivores do. To finish with Blake, like Janina, he prefers the innocence of very young children to the worn experience of adults. I think he would agree with her completely that, quote, "When a human being is to be born, a spark begins to fall," and the relevant word there is fall. Life, experience, is loss. Like Janina, Blake deeply distrusts reason and despises organized religion. It hadn't occurred to me, but Blake also allows Tokarczuk to show off her command of language. That's what the review for The Guardian noticed about the book. Here is a quotation from that review. "It also contains perhaps the most bravura translation performance I have ever seen, when Janina and her companion repeatedly attempt to translate a passage of Blake. Several versions of a particular verse are rendered in English, which has been translated from the Polish, which in turn has been translated from English. It is difficult to imagine a more tricky task for a translator, or one undertaken with more skill. So it lets Tokarczuk show off in Polish, and then her translators show off in English, and I have to say the translator is really good." So that's Blake. And now the harder question: why astrology? Well, in simple, technical terms, I think that it helps us to develop the feeling that Janina is crazy and therefore harmless. It's a red herring leading us away from the fact that she's the murderer. Janina believes, or affects to believe, that the stars predetermine everything, which of course would relieve her of responsibility for the murders. Though I do have to point out that if you carried that to its logical conclusion, it would mean that Bigfoot, the commandant, Innern, and the priest, the men she kills, weren't responsible for their actions either. There are probably deep philosophical implications here, but I can't see them. Frankly, I thought a lot of the astrology passages could have been lifted straight out without losing anything. But then, full disclosure, I'm a Capricorn, and Janina is pretty hard on Saturn, my ruling planet, and its grim effects. Admit the truth. Didn't you find yourself thinking that we really didn't need quite so much astrology? I certainly did. What else? Well, Janina has a bizarre, idealized vision of the Czech Republic across the border, a place where she believes all the slopes face south, where people read Blake after work, where the language is unsuited to quarreling. If you have ever visited Prague or read any Czech history or literature, you have to see this as a kind of joke that Tokarczuk is sharing with the reader. Given that Janina is the narrator and her interest in other people is very limited, I don't think that the other characters are fully developed, but at least 4 of them do seem to be very decent people. Which ones? Oddball. Remember, she gives everyone nicknames. Oddball, who volunteers to marry Janina when she gets out of jail. He may be strange, but he has a good heart. Dizzy, the police assistant who translates Blake in his own time. Good News, the boutique owner who loves horror fiction. And Boros, the entomologist, who has, by the way, a Jewish name, Schneiderman. Now, these are all people without power, on the margins, but they serve to rescue the novel from complete misanthropy. They may be strange, but they are essentially decent. Aside from those 4, the Grey Lady writer, who's one of the summer people, and maybe her wife Agatha, the professor and his wife, there aren't, aside from them, many decent people in Janina's world. One little sidebar. Janina's car, the Samurai, almost qualifies as a character. I had to look it up. I don't know much about cars. It was an actual make, discontinued from 1995 on in the United States because it had an unfortunate problem. It tended to roll over. The joke at the time was it was the only car that featured a sunroof in its floor. And that brings us to the villains. Bigfoot, the Commandant, Oddball's son, who she calls Blackcoat, Innern, and the priest, Father Russell. All 5 of them hunters, and all quite crooked. Tokarczuk really, really doesn't like priests, which, as I've mentioned, takes some courage in Poland. There is another issue in Drive Your Plow, which is so familiar in our own world that we might not notice it as sharply as a Polish reader would. As I said earlier, Tokarczuk is a strong feminist, and she's 60 years old. How does that weave through Drive Your Plow? Well, people dismiss Janina, undervalue her, mostly don't even see her. That's how she gets away literally with murder. Like the heroine in Doris Lessing's The Summer Before the Storm, Janina notices and it sometimes benefits from the invisibility of older women. I think Janina would instantly recognize the concept of the ajumma in Korean culture, as it's described in the novel Pachinko, which I'm sure many of you will have read. In Pachinko, the author Min Jin Lee explains, an ajumma is a woman who, no longer being desirable, is seen as kind of a third sex. The relevant character Sunja is described and sexually dismissed in this sentence. She wasn't hideous or shameful to look at, but she had prematurely reached the stage in a woman's life when no one noticed her entering or leaving a room. Tokarczuk actually takes that a notch further. Janina tells us on the first page that she is, quote, already at an age and additionally in a state where I must always wash my feet thoroughly before bed in the event of having to be removed by an ambulance in the night. It struck me that this is the equivalent for my generation of our mother's advice never to hold an undergarment together with a safety pin just in case you were hit by a car. The passage illustrates something we really need to mention, which is Janina does have a sense of humor. Was it something you noticed? At times, it seemed to me she came close to a understated stand-up comedy routine. For instance, she thinks of one of the villains, perhaps there were some angels watching over him. Sometimes they turn up on the wrong side. And a very accurate observation, it's a feature of flashlights that they're only visible in the daytime. She decides that the best conversations are with yourself, at least there's no risk of a misunderstanding. And one of her chapter headings is testosterone autism, which I think is a useful concept. I don't think Janina realizes how funny some of the astrology material is, but I'm sure that Tokarczuk does. Remember that Janina uses astrology even to explain the Solidarity movement. The summer of 1980, Jupiter in conjunction with Saturn in Libra, a powerful conjunction. Jupiter represents the authorities and Saturn the workers. What's more, Vajeza, that's Lech Vajeza, has the sun in Libra. Do you see? Dizzy asks which celestial body represents the police, and Janina answers, Pluto. It also represents the secret services and the mafia. She uses astrology to explain the French and Russian revolutions. In my terms, the woman is a nut bar. But she's hilarious on the summer people gardening in the wild. Here's the quote. In unison, they set about tearing up the plants that had been growing around their house until now in order to plant others that they'd bought at a shop. It was hard to tell what logic was driving them, why they didn't like elderberry but preferred wisteria in its place. Now I have to say, I really like wisteria, which means I'm not sure that Janina would like me. And finally, the murder weapon itself is frankly funny. Everyone has long forgotten that Janina's sport when she was younger was discus throwing. As she notes, people expect old ladies to walk around with plastic bags, and I certainly do fairly often. It provides the perfect weapon. If you want to get rid of the evidence, you just let it thaw. It reminded me irresistibly of the Lamb to the Slaughter episode in the old Alfred Hitchcock Presents show. It was an episode based on a short story by Roald Dahl. A woman learns that her husband is planning to divorce her, and she kills him with a blow from a frozen leg of lamb. Then she cooks the murder weapon and serves it to the detectives as they try to figure out how the victim was killed and where the weapon went. At other times, at least for me, the style was quite beautiful. For example, winter mornings are made of steel. They have a metallic taste and sharp edges. Or when she sees the white foxes, they look like the diplomatic service of the animals' kingdom, come here to reconnoiter. And another winter landscape, blades of grass were poking through its cover. From a distance it looked as if a large hand had begun to sketch an abstract pattern by practicing some short strokes, fine and subtle. So just a few more points. First, as I mentioned earlier, there are strong surreal elements in Drive Your Plow, but almost all of them are eventually explained in rational terms. The swarm of deer prints around the commandant's body, turns out that Janina made them herself. The villagers' bluish teeth right out of a vampire film, as if they were related to wolves. That turns out to be the incompetent dentist's preferred color for false teeth. Wolfeye, the forester, does not actually have oblong pupils like Rosemary's Baby. He has unevenly colored irises. That technique of creating these eerie elements and then deflating them, puncturing them, allows Tokarczuk to introduce an uncanny mood without actually fully endorsing a folkloric, magical vision of life, which would have undercut the book's credibility. And finally, the whole elaborate structure of murder, astrology, Blake, it's designed to let Tokarczuk ask basic existential questions. She did that more fully in the novel that won the Booker, Flights, which explores, among other themes, the idea that people are meant to be nomadic, always on the move, that settlement is a form of living death. As a character in that novel explains, whoever pauses will be petrified. Whoever stops, pinned like an insect, his heart pierced by a wooden needle, his hands and feet drilled through and pinned into the threshold and the ceiling. This is why tyrants of all stripes, infernal servants, have such deep-hated hatred for the nomads. This is why they persecute the gypsies and the Jews, and why they force all free people to settle, assigning the addresses that serve as our sentences. That idea shows up just slightly in this book, too, with Dr. Alley's belief that you should own only as much as can be packed into 2 manageable bags to allow for a quick departure. So finally, what is the most important issue presented by Drive Your Plow? Well, the book certainly could be designed to turn its readers into vegans, and I think that is actually one of Tokarczuk's aims. But beyond that, there is the question of what we are for, why we are here. Remember that Janina visits Oddball and is entranced by his drawer of what he calls essential items. The passage reads, "In dapper gray compartments lay some very neatly arranged kitchen utensils, a rolling pin, an egg whisk, a tiny battery-powered milk beater, and also some utensils I couldn't identify. They looked like surgical instruments for complicated operations." That's the quote. Oddball whisks some milk for her coffee, deliberates for a while, and then chooses a stencil of a heart to sprinkle cocoa on top. And Yanina goes on, later that day I thought about his drawer again, that peeping into it brought me total calm, and that I would really like to be one of those useful utensils. And that's not surprising. Yanina thinks a lot about usefulness, about which human beings are of use and how. And like Jean-Paul Sartre, she envies the absence of consciousness of instruments, or in his case, trees. The underlying argument made in Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead is that conforming to nature is sanity, whereas conforming to human rules is idiocy. Remember, the writer in the novel, the Grey Lady, suggests near the end that human beings make up their own vision of life and its rules, and then remain miserable trying to live up to that self-created vision. For Yanina, to be in constant grief because of the cruelty of man is not misanthropy. It's pure logic. That's the deepest question in the book, I think. As Yanina asks, what sort of world is this where killing and pain are the norm? What on earth is wrong with us? And I have to say, it's a good question. Here is one lovely thing about pre-recording these lectures. You have the opportunity for second thoughts. So here are a couple of those. I realize now that I should have paid more attention to the book's very gifted translator, Antonia Lloyd-Jones, because her story is interesting in itself. So let's go. She's 59 years old, born in Oxford. She became a translator, she says now, by complete accident. She started in the 1980s, inspired by what she's called the gloom and doom of the communist system, and by her concern for her Polish friends, who feared that their future was hopeless. Let me quote from a profile of Antonia in the literary journal The Boar. In trying to find a role for herself in this fight against communism, she eventually found that her role was a literary one, achieving this transition into translation by getting involved with a London-based publisher of Polish books that were illegal in Poland. She soon found herself translating literature through that connection. It's an extremely good way of telling people here what was happening there, Antonia suggested, adding that, and this is a quote, literature is one of the things that connects minds and breaks down barriers. She won the 2018 Transatlantic Award for the most outstanding promoter of Polish literature abroad. It's a prize she definitely deserves. Without her tireless campaigning, combined with that of her fellow translator Jennifer Croft, I wouldn't be talking to you about this book, because it would never have been translated into English. Publishers were not initially interested in Tokarczuk, partly because she doesn't have a consistent style and genre, which makes her harder to market. Croft translated Tokarczuk's novel Flight, and therefore she was the co-winner of the Booker International Award, which that book won. Lloyd-Jones appeared to be genuinely and generously happy about that. She did mention later that the Booker win, not to mention the later Nobel Prize, helped to boost the sales of Tokarczuk's books that she had translated, rather than Jennifer Croft, and that means income for her. She can afford to be generous at this point because she's become successful. She translates children's books as well as adult literature, by the way. But it wasn't like that at the beginning. She has written that she worked 9-to-5 jobs for years on top of her translation work to survive and eventually to earn enough to buy a house. She had a plan. She figured that if work dried up, she'd be able to rent out the house and live somewhere cheaper. As a result of living through those lean years, she's very active now in organizations that promote translators' work and rights, and she mentors younger people. I mentioned in an earlier segment of this talk that Drive Your Plow provides an opportunity for virtuoso work for a translator, in Dizzy's and Yanina's attempts to translate some of Blake's poetry. I had assumed this chance would be a treat for a translator, but I was wrong. Lloyd-Jones told an interviewer that she was quite rebellious at first, but she did manage it in the end. The difficulty arose when she realized that she couldn't, quote, translate William Blake into not William Blake. That doesn't make any sense at all. Eventually, however, she did work out a way to make up some bad versions of William Blake, which she notes people seem to like and find funny, thus overcoming what she called the difficulty of recreating a piece of poetry that everyone knows in English, but recreating it badly. I think she greatly overestimated her readers' familiarity with Blake's poems, but you can see her point. For instance, Blake wrote, "I traveled through a land of men and women too, and heard and saw such dreadful things as cold earth wanderers never knew." Dizzy and Janina transform it into presumably limping Polish, since one of the translation reads, "Over human lands I wandered, lands of men and also women, seeing, hearing things so fearful, such as no mind ever summoned." Because Lloyd-Jones does it so well, I had assumed she was having fun, but she says it was a real ordeal. It's all part of what she sees as her role in life, which is to promote understanding. She's said, literature is an absolutely brilliant, universal way of understanding our world better, being in contact with other parts of it, and understanding that we're all a big part of one whole thing and have so much in common. Ultimately, literature has the power to explain so much to us through stories and storytelling. Let me turn now to Olga Tokarczuk, the author herself, for 2 more points. First, I was able to track down exactly what Olga Tokarczuk has said about becoming a writer after reading Freud, a statement that fascinated me. She wrote, "I first read Sigmund Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle as a young girl, and it helped me to understand that there are thousands of possible ways to interpret our experience, that everything has a meaning, and that interpretation is the key to reality. This was the first step to becoming a writer." That makes sense to me. And remember, she became a psychologist as well. And one final point. I realize, looking back on Drive Your Plow, that I have rather slighted one other major theme, one that speaks strongly to a woman of my age, as clearly it does to Tokarczuk herself. When Janina looks at her neighbor's body, dead from choking on a deer's bone, we eventually learn, she thinks, "Just a piece of matter, reduced to a fragile object, separated from everything else. It made me feel sad, horrified. The same fate awaits me too, and Oddball, and the deer outside. One day we shall all be nothing more than corpses." In fairness, I should note that Janina is far more upset a few minutes later by the discovery of the deer's head, but that passage that I just read illustrates a thread that runs through the whole book, Janina's sense of human decay and mortality. The biologist Camille Oxen, writing for National Public Radio, noticed something that all other reviewers missed, it seems to me. He wrote, "The story has Janina and the reader hitting the limits of capability, of believability, even a real and tangible limit like a national border. There's an extended metaphor, for instance, wherein the Czech-Polish border indicates Janina's sense of restriction. After a neighbor winds up dead, Janina pulls out her cell phone to call the police. And this is a quote from the book. "Soon after, an automated Czech voice responded. That's what happens here. The signal wanders with no regard for the national borders. Its capricious nature is hard to predict." Later, Janina treads to and fro across the border, as if testing out the limits of sovereignty. Limits are at the heart of the matter here, the selective limits placed on some human lives, like the elderly Janina, and not others, like the voracious village hunters. Still, I would have to say that by the end, Janina has in fact crossed that border into the freedom that Poland, at that point when it's been established that she's a murderer, really wants to snatch from her. Oxen acknowledges in his review the novel's focus on our treatment of nature and animals, but he goes on after that to write, "Ultimately, the novel is a lament for the lonely, dismissed Janina, too. What have you done in life?" a man asks Janina. And she's left speechless. For people of my age, she thinks, the places that they truly loved and to which they once belonged are no longer there. The places of their childhood and youth have ceased to exist. As if their outer form has been preserved, it's all the more painful, like a shell with nothing inside it anymore. I have nowhere to return to. It's like a state of imprisonment. The walls of the cell are the horizon of what I can see. Now, that's very much a feature of aging in the modern world. I suppose especially for people who, like Tokarczuk, grew up in the Soviet Union. I myself, in the Polish cities of Stasov and Kielce, hunted for landmarks that were long before plowed into the earth by the Nazis, the Russians, or simply progress. Even without that, there is plenty to lament as our bodies decline towards our inevitable end. That would be a dismal note to end on, so I won't end here. Instead, let me close by reminding you that in spite of all of its rage and sorrow, there is a jauntiness to drive your plow. By the end, even a sense of proportion. Remember one of the social occasions that Yanina actually enjoys just before she invites Boris into her bed. She and Boris and Oddball are drinking and talking, and the conversation turns to personality. Why are some people so evil and nasty? The visitors list a host of reasons: abuse, trauma, television, maybe dietary deficiencies. Yanina characteristically and stubbornly insists on the influence of the stars, but it now seems like a flight of fancy, not a fixed belief. But it is Saturn, I said, the book says, dying of laughter. In that moment of levity, with other people around, all of the creepiness that affects so much of the novel evaporates, and Yanina, eccentric, lonely, driven Yanina, embraces Boris, and their love affair begins. Thank you, and good night.